like we have some questions about this.
So just a short update before we get introduction. So there is no seminar next week, but the following week we'll kick back off on it. So just make note of that. Post that. Sign up if you're in the class and.
Good morning, everyone. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Mark Stanback. Dr. Stanback earned his PhD from the University of California, Berkeley, and his bachelor's from Davidson College, which he then returned and served as a professor. He taught courses such as zoology and behavioral ecology, but his research focuses on, we're going to hear about shortly, focuses on avian behavioral ecology. And we will be talking today about Namibian hornbills. But he has published numerous publications throughout his career, and he's actually on my committee, so I'm very grateful to have him here. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Stanback.
Now, I apologize if I hobbled a little bit. I had a skiing accident in Colorado, so not steady on my feet. So, in addition to studying bluebirds and tree swallows, which we're going to study, I have a side project going in Namibia, and I've been studying hornbills over there. Montero's hornbill, which is pictured here, but also there's where I work. Also yellow-billed hornbills and red-billed or Damara hornbills, and then there's the Montero's hornbills. And these hornbills are, as you can see, omnivorous. Unlike, I guess, Asian hornbills and African forest hornbills that are primarily herbivorous, these guys will eat anything they can fit in their bill. Or opened up nest boxes and pulled out chicks with baby birds stuck in them. Oh. One unusual thing about hornbills is their nesting behavior, and I'm going to be talking quite a bit about this. They're cavity nesters, but they seal up. The female seals herself inside the hole. A lot of people say the male seals her inside. It's not that insidious. The female makes that plug herself, and she leaves a slit in the plug for the male to stick food through and for her and her chicks to shit out. So you can often find hornbill nests just by looking on the ground and hearing it. I've taken advantage of this by putting up nest boxes, and I can access the female and the chicks via the trap door here. And even though she feels very sealed in, I have 100% access to her and her chicks the entire time she's in there. So they're peeking out. And today I'll be talking about the sex lives of these hornbills. And the first thing a female does when she decides to nest is she chooses a male who is usually defending a nest site, a hole in a tree. And then she'll copulate with that male, and then she'll seal herself into the cavity. So she usually starts building the nest plug, or the male will start building the nest plug. I suppose that's how people got the impression that males seal the female in. Is the male, in advertising his nest hole, will start building the nest plug and say, hey, this is a really nice cavity. You want to come use this? But the female seals herself in, and then she repeatedly gets fed by the male. And she'll spend anywhere from 1 to 10 or more days in there getting fed by the male. And then she'll begin to lay eggs. And one thing I'll be talking about today is the pattern of egg production. When she's is immediately following the laying of the egg, she molts her flight feathers, her wing and tail feathers, in which case she becomes helpless in there. And I have had, in one case, I had a female who, turn my phone off so it doesn't bother us. In one case, I had a female who I think her mate died while she was featherless inside there, and she started losing weight and her chicks died, and she finally just broke out. She spent 7 hours pecking at the plug to get it to open up. And then she jumped out and she hadn't regrown her flight feathers yet. So presumably she got eaten, but I guess it was better than starving to death. So then once she molts her flight feathers, she regrows them slowly. But it often takes, multiple weeks for her to get to that stage. And at that point, her chicks are growing. So it gets very crowded inside, especially natural cavities, with a female trying to grow her feathers and her chicks, getting bigger. And when the chicks are about half grown, the females will break out and start helping the male eat the chicks. And so I was able to monitor this activity by opening up boxes and seeing what was going on inside the nest cavity for the entire cycle. And it's about a 3-month cycle from when the dad, when the female goes in to when the last chick leaves the nest. It's about 3 months, which is handy because that's how long the visa is in Namibia. Now, one issue with the fact that the females, they don't copulate through that nest plug. They copulate before they go in, which means they have to store sperm to fertilize the eggs. And sperm storage takes place down here in the uterovaginal junction near the cloaca. There's sperm storage tubules, and the females will store the sperm with their mate, for multiple weeks until the last egg is laid. And one thing I haven't mentioned is that, it's like a 3 or 4 day period often between the eggs. And so it can be multiple weeks between her last copulation and her last egg. So females have to be able to store sperm to fertilize those last eggs. And once they're storing sperm, that means they can choose which males they use to father their offspring. So if a female cheats on her male, he copulates with another male during that early stage when copulation is taking place, she can decide sort of with the sperm storage, it's last in is first out. And so they can manipulate the paternity of their broods potentially by using sperm storage. So females should attempt to be fertilized by high quality males. And a high quality male can be hard for us to determine. For birds, it's often a male who is not their paternal mate. And so it could be the guy down the street, and it often is the guy who had an older male who has a female and offspring who just happens to be the local stud, and the female should have him father her offspring. And males, however, should attempt to control the female, the sex lives of their mates, because it benefits them to monopolize the copulations and to be the parent of that brood. And the success of the male in trying to control the female, a lot of that depends on how dependent the female is on the male. So the extra pair paternity reflects a balance between a female's needs and a male's desire to control the female. So between a female's choice of male genetic quality and the need for male assistance. So if females are needy, males should demand fidelity in exchange for all this assistance they're giving, the food they're bringing. And female hornbills certainly need assistance because they're locked inside their nest cavity and depend on the male to basically pay for everything. And I'll talk about that in just a minute. So if as a consequence of a female partner engaging in extra pair copulations, a male partner withholds all care, resulting in reproductive failure, it will pay females to remain faithful and retain their partner's full assistance. So this was said back in 1996. Realize that was before you were born, but this has been the thinking that a female's that her choice and mate is not 100%, that she's constrained by the need for male assistance. And for hornbills, this amounts to coercion. So is the male demanding fidelity in exchange for all the resources that he's bringing to the table. And so the male is essentially paying for everything. He's paying for egg formation because he's been courtship feeding the female even before the female enters the box. Once she pairs up with him and says, I like you, I like this nest site, he starts feeding her. And he'll feed her through, before she seals herself in, and then again after she seals herself in. Once she molts her feathers, it's the male who's essentially paying for the female's molt. So she's losing all her tail and wing feathers, and it's the male who's paying the food costs, the energetic costs of her growing those feathers back. The female has to incubate the eggs that she's produced, and it's the male's food that pays for this incubation. The cost of chick rearing, the male has to do 100% up until the female leaves the nest chamber, 100% of the foraging and bringing food to the nest, whether it's mice or baby birds or insects or what have you. So if a female cheats on her mate, the male is not going to be amused, and he will do everything in his power to try to control that female's choice of mate. So does the vulnerability of female hornbills and their dependence on this costly male assistance, override any opportunities for, playing the field and getting copulations from other males? And you could ask that same question a little bit abbreviated by, do females cheat? And the way that we look at that is through DNA fingerprinting. And so getting the females and the chicks, getting blood samples was not too difficult. I would just open up the box and pull out the female and the chicks. Catching the males was a little bit more trouble because they would show up at the nest and they would be very hesitant to feed if you tried to catch them. But I was successful in catching, and there are the babies. And you can see there's extreme hatching asynchrony. So if any of you are interested in extreme hatching asynchrony, this is an ideal system to look at that. There's a female in a box. And so I was using DNA fingerprinting to assess paternity in these birds. And so I used multiple loci. And so if the mom and the child, the mom has this pattern, the child has this pattern, and the dad has this pattern, we can say, yes, those chicks belong to the father. And so if we look at the number of mismatched bands and have a cutoff and say, okay, anything more than two mismatched bands is not okay. We see that there is no hanky-panky going on in hornbills. So there are 135 nestlings and 38 broods. So that's 38 cases where I had both mom and dad and the chicks bled. There were no cases of extra pair paternity. So this suggests that hornbills are genetically monogamous. So they're not only do they pair up singly, but the females don't cheat on their mates. And most birds do cheat. So all the birds you see around here probably cheat on their mates to some degrees. And so the females, I mean, the bluebirds I study, the tree swallows I study are famous. So like half the kids in the brood aren't fathered by the guy who's taking care of them. Whereas hornbills, and it's been further shown in other species that hornbills are genetically monogamous, but not that many birds are. I mean, albatrosses and Florida scrub jays are genetically monogamous, and hornbills are genetically monogamous, but a few other species are. And so this is sort of my opinion. So I hopefully have convinced you that male coercion is causing oops. Why? So my point is, it's probably not true male coercion, because why would the female evolve a simultaneous molt of all her flight feathers if the male was able to use that to, you know, force her to be faithful to him? And I would say, no, it's unlikely that the female would have evolved that. I mean, in my opinion, and it is just my opinion, that the coercion happened afterwards. And so the molt and any male attempts to use the molt happened after genetic monogamy had already evolved. And so it seems as if it looks like coercion, but it might not be coercion if a female was, you know, involved in the evolution of the simultaneous molt. And male uniparental care, I think it also evolved after they had already decided, okay, we're going to have genetic monogamy, and you know, once we have that genetic monogamy decided, then we can, you know, go off and have something that looks like coercion. So that was part one, which was the genetic monogamy of hornbills. And next, I wanted to look at the cost of egg production. And if you look in the literature at egg production birds, they divide it up into capital breeding, which the classic example are these snow geese, which show up in the Arctic, and there's nothing but snow and ice everywhere. And they can lay a dozen eggs using their endogenous reserves. And on the other hand, you have income breeding, which tree swallows are a great example. They'll catch bugs when the sun shines, and then as soon as it starts snowing, they stop laying eggs. So they make their eggs with what they gathered yesterday, and so with their income. And so a lot of species are defined as either being capital breeders or income breeders, depending on how long they store their energy reserves for before they start laying eggs. And so I wanted to know, well, can we use this model on the hornbills? Are some females, not so much the entire species, but like, are certain females more capital breeder and certain females more income breeder? And so I was using eggs. Here's an egg. And on this graph, you see the red arrow represents when the female goes into the box. And so some females lay a lot of eggs, and some lay relatively few eggs. And so one thing I can look at is clutch size. Also inter-egg intervals. I talked about the hatching asynchrony. So there are some females that will space out their eggs in time every, 3 or 4 days, and other females will lay every other day. And so there's a lot of variation among females in, how they produce their eggs. So I was thinking initially, oh, well, maybe this has something to do with endogenous reserves versus food that the male is bringing. Also, there's variation in egg size, that some females have very large eggs and some females have relatively small eggs. And if you measure eggs, you can calculate their size and whether they're different. So within clutches and between clutches. So within clutches, as I'll show a data slide in a minute, showing that egg size variation changes over the course of laying. So some females are very uniform in their egg production, and some females are very, very different in their egg production from one another. And the length of the pre-laying interval. So some females will go into their nest and immediately the next day will start laying eggs. And other females will wait like 10 days before they start laying. And so this pre-laying interval will vary according to different females. And then if you combine all of them, you see, oh, well, there's variation in clutch size, there's variation in egg size, there's variation in pre-laying interval, there's variation in inter-egg interval. And so what we see on the ground is a lot of variation between females and a lot of different categories. So some females are very large, so up to 450 grams. Some females are very small, 245 grams. Clutch size can range, in the Montero's hornbill, can range from 2 to 7. The pre-laying interval is 1 to 12 days. The inter-egg interval is 2 to 7 days. And often they'll have an inter-egg interval that gets shorter as time goes on, or gets longer as time goes on, excuse me. And then the mean egg volume changes as well. So the field protocol is I would check to have about 100 boxes out there, about 50 in any given year get used by hornbills. And there are different parts of the place where I work. So I check the boxes every 2 to 3 days. And I mark eggs as they appear in the nest. And then once a female finishes laying eggs and has molted her feathers, and there's variation, this is one thing I'm very interested in now, is the variation in the amount of time females wait between the laying of their last egg and the dropping of their feathers. Some females, it's very abrupt, and some females will wait 2 weeks before they drop their feathers. And so I think this might play into this somehow. But once a female finishes laying and she's lost her feathers, I can do anything with her and she won't break out. I've talked to some ringers, banders over in Africa, and they'll just pull a female out regardless. And I'm like, oh, I'm a little nervous about doing that. I feel like a female might want to abandon her nest if you manhandle her too quickly after she's laid her eggs before or in the middle of laying her eggs. But once she's done laying and she's lost her feathers, she's not going to go anywhere because she knows if she escapes, she'll just get eaten by something. And so I typically wait until the female has finished laying her eggs, and then I get her, and her sort of day zero weight is after she's lost her feathers. So if going back to the income breeding and capital breeding, I would predict that females with greater energy reserves, that is, females who are capable of becoming capital breeders, are capital breeders. And so greater energy reserves that they're going into the nest with, less dependence on the male, produces more eggs and bigger eggs. And also these females with greater energy reserves, I figured, well, they can start laying sooner, and they're not forced to wait and be fed by their male for a week or two until they can start laying eggs. So they start laying eggs immediately, and I think they can produce eggs faster if they start sooner. And so here are some data. This is pre-laying interval and clutch size. It was highly significant. We see that the pre-laying interval, the longer the pre-laying interval, the greater the or the less the clutch size. So clutch size is greater early on, and as you get out to the tail end, it's smaller. So females who spend a lot of time getting fed by their mate tend to lay fewer total eggs than their mates do, than other females do. I also looked at pre-laying interval and the mean egg volume. And so this is basically egg size. And so females who have long pre-laying intervals over 10 days, tended to have the mean egg volume you can see on the y-axis here tends to be greater. So females who lay larger eggs were able to start laying sooner than females who laid smaller eggs. And then the laying order I looked at, for all the females, I basically assessed their egg size based on their first egg. And so you'll see this is the y-axis, the x-axis starts with number 2, 3, 4, and so on. And you can see that, the biggest egg is the second egg. It's a little bit over the size of their first egg. Their third egg tends to be about the same size as their first egg. And then from there on, their fourth egg and fifth egg tends to be so as a female progresses, and this may or may not have anything to do with the chick condition. I saw a lot of brood reduction, but females who lay large numbers of eggs tended to be to lay smaller eggs. And then the inter-egg interval also tended to grow. So between the second and third egg, we saw about 2.6 days, and between the first and the second egg was 2.4 days. So as the laying interval increased, we saw the number of eggs per laid increased with the lay order and the inter-egg interval. So, by the time we get to 6 eggs, between the fifth and the sixth eggs was over 3 days between the fifth egg and the sixth egg. And so as the clutch continued to grow, we got a greater and greater difference in the pre-laying interval and the inter-egg interval, which translates into the hatching, because females start incubating as soon as their first egg is laid. And so we see greater hatching asynchrony in bigger clutches. And so the lay order and inter-egg interval is definitely related. And then finally, big females tended to lay bigger eggs than small females. And so you can see this was a significant trend that small females, female mass, smaller females tended to have smaller eggs, bigger females tended to have bigger eggs. And though it wasn't 100%, it was, there was certainly a trend for that to occur. So long pre-laying intervals are associated with smaller clutches. Long pre-laying intervals are associated with smaller eggs. And eggs get smaller over the course of laying. And inter-egg intervals lengthen over the course of laying. So as you get longer and longer intervals, or as you get larger and larger clutch sizes, you get longer and longer intervals. And then finally, large females make large eggs. So is this capital or income? And I would say it's both. Because as we saw, there are some females who, if you look at females as a whole, there seem to be sort of two different kinds. Some that lay bigger eggs immediately, and they tend to have larger clutches and shorter inter-egg intervals, and a short pre-laying interval, and then others where the female is dependent on the male to bring food to produce those eggs, and they tend to have fewer eggs and smaller eggs and all that. So these I would categorize as being capital breeders. These I was categorized as being income breeders. So I think the long pre-laying interval is indicative of income breeding. So there are diminishing returns because, yes, on one hand, she gets her male to pay more of the cost of egg production, but she's producing smaller eggs and overall, and she has fewer eggs, so smaller clutches. And long inter-egg intervals also mean more income breeding. So again, we see diminishing returns because these later chicks that are produced as a result of the longer inter-egg intervals suffer from greater hatching asynchrony. And so I think the later chicks die more often under these circumstances. So that's the second part of my talk. Third part of my talk is, when do females decide to stop laying eggs? I mean, they could just produce tons and tons of eggs like this chicken here or the zebra finches I had as pets. One time the females would just continue to lay eggs and never know when to stop. And so when does the hornbill stop? And so it's been shown that birds can be categorized as determinate layers or indeterminate layers. And addition determinacy means they have a plans for however many eggs they want to lay, regardless of the number of eggs you add in the interim. And so I wanted to know, well, do hornbills, are they, do they exhibit addition determinacy? And there are a couple reasons to think that they might. One is that hornbills start incubation immediately, so they're very understanding of the number of eggs they have, and because most birds, they wait until they completed their clutch before they start incubating. Hornbills will start incubating possibly because the female just can't help it. She's stuck in a box or in a nest cavity with the eggs, and she can't move for 2 months. And so she's sort of stuck there on top of her eggs. And so there's not much she can do. So maybe she's really in tune, either visually because the eggs are white in a dark box, or tactily with the eggs. So here's an example of a female hornbill's nest. I've pulled the female out. This is one of the plastic boxes I use. And we'll talk about them in a minute. But so the plastic, this is a Montero's nest, and those are the eggs that she's laid. And again, I would check that box every 2 or 3 days and mark the eggs as they appeared underneath her. And then once she molts her flight feathers, then I can pull her out and measure her or do whatever I want. And at that point, I can talk about the egg size and the inter-egg intervals, because even though I'm not checking the box every single day, I can still usually say, you can sort of tell that some of these eggs are dirtier than others, and the females how clean an egg is often indicative of how fresh it is. And so I can, when I pull out the eggs to number them, I can say, oh, well, number 1 is very dirty compared to number 5. And I can, make adjustments along the way as necessary. So when I found a single fresh egg, I did an experiment. So when I found a single fresh egg, I would add model eggs, and model eggs, you could buy anything on the internet, well, almost anything. I tried to buy snake smell on the internet. But you can find pretty much anything else, including bird eggs, fake bird eggs. And so I found model eggs that were just the right size and the right color, and I would add them to hornbill nests. When I found one egg, I would add 3 model eggs. And then I would put the female back in. And if females are sensitive to either tactile clues or visual cues, they would say, oh gosh, there's already X number of eggs in there. I'm just going to lay one more and I'll be done. And so they should lay, there should be fewer actual hornbill eggs in the nest. Now, if females are not basing their decisions on tactile or visual cues, we should see, a female saying, well, I wanted to lay 5 eggs, and who cares if there's 3 in here? I wanted to lay 5, and so there should be 8 eggs in there total. And so I was able to do this experiment. And I added wooden eggs to 11 nests and 16 nests for control nests. And I know the sample size is not huge, but the clutch size in these 2 different kinds of nests did not differ. So in the experimental nest, females laid 5.54, and in control nest, they laid 5.56. So pretty much identical clutch sizes in both experimental types of nests. The next thing I wanted to look at was, it has been reported in the literature, especially in zoo settings, that people had hypothesized that the simultaneous molt of females has something to do with the light exposure of the females. And so once a female sews herself into a cavity, it's very dark suddenly, and it's dark for weeks at a time. And so I wanted to know, is there a relationship between the simultaneous molt and the dark? And so I looked at wooden boxes, which were 100% opaque and were super dark, and then plastic boxes like you saw earlier. And I measured the females, and I looked at whether their molt was simultaneous or not quite simultaneous. And then I did a Fisher exact test on the number of simultaneous and non-simultaneous in wood versus plastic. And what I found was that for Montero's hornbills, there seems to, some females, they'll have a weird feather sticking out. So they've lost all their feathers except for one tail feather or one feather. So I counted those females as being non-simultaneous. And I found there was no relationship between, in any of the hornbills that nest, Montero's, Damara, or yellow-billed, any of the hornbills that nest at my site, in the probability that they would use, or that they would be simultaneous or non-simultaneous, and it had nothing to do with the type of box they were in. So I found no difference between the molt of females in translucent plastic boxes versus opaque wooden boxes. And the molt of females seems to be stimulated by the completion of egg laying rather than the amount of light that the females receive during this time. And with that, does anyone know the name of this bird?
Zazu.
Zazu, correct. So that's from the Lion King. I like the this is the site where I worked in Namibia, and the sunset there. And I want to thank my assistants in the field, also the people who provided logistic help and the organizations, and the funding that I received from a number of different organizations. Davidson College. All right, I would be more than happy to take any questions you have right now. Yes.
Okay, so great talk. I really like the question that you were exploring about the capital versus income breeder. So in relation to that study, did you ever have like odd females who maybe look more like capital breeders that would stop laying early, but start early also and divert that income to their own maintenance instead of eggs?
It's a good question. I don't know off the top of my head, but I would say not. That most females were predictable in how they behaved.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Really cool. I learned a lot. I'm curious if it seems like the females are sort of putting themselves in categories of like income versus capital. Because they're generalists, is there any correlation with like the type of food items that are being brought to them, and if the male is like an efficient forager and how that might relate to?
I mean, I did try, I put cameras on them, and one issue was that the males are often bringing nest material at the same time they're bringing food. And so it was hard to tell, was this a crunched up leaf or a crunched up bug and crunched up baby bird or what have you. So I was not able to tell from the videos I took what the male was bringing. But I think there is, certainly I think the food items the males bring probably are important. And I don't really know how important. Other questions?
Just a follow-up to that question about how close the nest boxes are. So I feel like
They're about 300 meters away. I tried to do an experiment looking at the different, because other species will use them, hoopoes and wood hoopoes and owlets and such. And so initially I put out the boxes close to one another, assuming that, oh, well, a hornbill will not nest right beside a hornbill, but a hornbill will nest right beside a hornbill. And so that experiment went out the window, and I was forced to spread out my boxes. So it's figured, well, as long as I'm gonna only get hornbills or 90% hornbills, I might as well make it easy for the hornbills. So I stopped trying to look at interspecific competition among the birds, because I knew it would get messed up by the hornbills, and just decided to study the hornbills. Question back there.
Two questions. One, what is the male's molting process like? And two, do they have any nest predators like snakes or anything else?
The male's molting is, if a female doesn't breed, she molts like a male, which means, non-simultaneously, just one feather at a time, one feather a week or something at the end of the breeding season. I don't know that personally, but from the literature, that's what I've gathered. As far as predation on the nest, there seems to be relatively low predation. I did have some issues with honey badgers, who were badass. Who would punch their way through the nest plug, because the Monteros especially build lame nest plugs. The nest plug built by the Damaras and the yellowbills are these huge internal things. And so they, even if something breaks through it, they're not going to knock it out. Whereas the Monteros built a lame-o nest plug that you can just punch out easily. And so I think under natural circumstances, I don't know. I think these predators probably knew about my boxes, and I put cameras on them to try to figure out. And I had, during the one day when the female pecks out and the kids are half grown, I have had predation then, like a mongoose would go in. Once a female breaks out, mongoose will go in and eat all the kids. And it's like, okay, that's not good. But most of the time they're relatively safe, and like the small hole keeps out the snakes and stuff. And so I didn't worry too much about cobras or mambas getting in the boxes, because the female would, for the chicks, once they were big, they would peck at anything that came towards the hole. So I didn't worry about that.
Is that me again?
Sure.
Yeah, I got one for you. What is longevity like in these birds? And then do you have the data to understand whether they choose the same mates? They show any fidelity?
I mean, I don't know that much about the males. I can tell you more about the females than the males, because I catch the females every year. And the females will show up in a different box sometimes. And so one thing is, during the non-breeding season, these birds will range really widely. And I've been wanting to put on radio tags to assess how far afield they go. And there's some people will argue, oh, well, Monteros, which is where most of my data is, they're rain trackers. And so they'll go to a different place in Namibia that has had more rain and has more insects, more food, and they'll breed there, and then they're not breeding every year. And I've had some females who do breed every year, and I've had some females where it'll be 4 years between the time I see them. So it's hard to really say exactly what's going on with the non-breeding season. My guess is that, there are certain species like the yellowbills they stay around more than the Monteros and the redbills do, who seem to range further afield. So that would be an interesting thing to look at.
Lifespan in general?
Oh, lifespan in general. They're big birds. And so I think there's a pretty strong correlation between lifespan and body size in birds. And so I think 15 to 20 years. And I think, I think there's a lot of mortality. My data says there's a lot of mortality. A lot of the chicks that I put rings on or bands on do not end up as breeders in the population. Or breeder females in the population. And so I think there's a lot of mortality at young ages, and then once they get to, older age, I'll recapture a female again and again. And so I think once they hit adulthood and figure out how life works, then they're pretty good to go. Yeah.
I know that they're getting fed the whole time that they're in the boxes, but it's not like they're really like doing home workouts, I think. So are there any issues after they break out, like where they still need assistance in some foraging or what?
When the females break out, one thing is they seem not to be able to fly super well. I think being cramped up inside a box for 2 months and not being able to stretch your wings makes it a little bit difficult. I'm sort of amazed they're able to do anything at all when they get out. But I think I've found that females, when they leave the cavity, they sometimes shirk on the food that they're bringing back. And I don't have a lot of good data for this, but where I'm able to tell a male from the female easily, I can say, okay, this one is only coming once an hour and this one is coming 3 times an hour. And so I think there is a difference there. So I think the males do most of the work. They do all of the work at the beginning, and I think they're so used to doing all of the work that they continue to do. One thing I've been curious about is how does a male decide what his maximum is? Because he can't see the chicks inside the nest, and he doesn't know whether there's 2 or 7 in there, and they're different sizes, and there's different amounts of food he should be bringing, and he doesn't really know. There's some vocalizations, but even that I think is tricky. So I think the males probably is more complicated than we realize. Yeah.
So what's the advantage of a simultaneous molt? I mean, 2 months seems like a very long time to be in the box. Like, why don't the female
Yeah.
just do a regular?
I mean, the simultaneous molt, I guess as long as you have 2 months when you're not doing anything, you might as well just lose all your feathers and grow them out. And there's been some work done showing that females will leave the nest as soon as their feathers have grown, regardless of whether the size of the chicks, because in some cases, the chicks they haven't figured out, oh, I can pick up this food item off the floor of the box. I mean, the floor of the box, there's nest material, but it's filled with these beetle larvae, thousands of beetle larvae that will eat anything. And so any dropped food gets eaten by beetle larvae. But I've seen baby hornbills, like with a pile of dead insects below the entrance hole that the male has dropped in. And the big baby has figured out, oh, I can pick up these insects and eat them. But the little babies are like, feed me, ah. And they haven't figured it out. And so I think there is a cost to the female leaving before, because as long as the female's in there, she can take care of those little kids who are saying, feed me, and she can put the food in their mouth. But once she's gone, it's the law of the jungle there. And so I sort of see brood production happening in two ways. One, initially when they hatch, they start starving, even though the female's in there and she can divvy out the food however she sees fit. And then once the female leaves, I see another batch of brood production and starvation of the chicks. Other questions?
Yeah, so it seems like one of the evolutionary pressures here is the limited number of these ideal cavities, right, Ski? So from conservation strategy, if you're putting out these boxes to try to increase hornbills, would you see some of these behaviors, monogamy, go away if you flooded the landscape with nest boxes?
I mean, I've sort of flooded the landscape with nest boxes myself. And even though I have them spaced out, there was a student, I had a student who got his PhD at Virginia Tech who was looking at the availability of natural cavities, and he found that big cavities were super rare. And so there seemed to be a lot of competition for those bigger cavities. And those were the ones that hornbills like. And so, I mean, I would see red-billed hornbills, the smallest species, nesting in something in a cavity the size of a bluebird box. But the Monteros need a bigger cavity. They're typically cliff nesters, and so they're like, I'm not even going to bother with finding a cavity in a tree hole. I'm going to use a cliff hole. And just wall up whatever is needed. And I think a lot of the behaviors are sort of hardwired in these birds, but I think if I wanted to look at competition or something, that would be my having boxes there. And if I've upped the carrying capacity of hornbills in the area, that probably has influenced them. And so I have to be careful about what questions that is using, even though I have lots of nest boxes. Other questions?
Great, let's thank Mark one more time. Feel free to come up and ask any more questions, and those of you signed up for lunch, we'll get started with that here in the same room in a couple minutes.
Thank you for all stepping away.
Yeah, available.